In this session, we will be discussing the ethnic or the BAME attainment disparity in higher education in light of the academic drift theory. In my last session, I spoke at some length about academic drift as a phenomenon and its importance in understanding the issue of skill deficit. In this session, we will apply academic drift as an analytical framework, as a way of making sense of BAME student experiences, particularly within the context of professional or vocational education. Now, in order to do this, I will speak a bit about the data on ethnic participation and attainment in higher education as a way of understanding the context. Then I will delve into theory, unpicking one dominant framework, which is critical race theory or CRT, and then finally explaining how academic drift helps us overcome some of the limitations that arise from using critical race theory. So, the discussion of ethnic attainment in HE really gains currency as we begin to see greater numbers of ethnic minority students participating in higher education, particularly the Asian student category. Asian students are roughly 25% of the HE student population, even though they constitute only 18% of the school leaving cohort. The participation levels amongst Asian students are also increasing. So from 2011 to 2016, there was a 35% increase of Asian students compared to a 5.5% increase of white students. Increased levels of Asian student participation has led to some interesting discussions around the question of how some working class ethnic minority students, namely from the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi background, are participating in HE in greater numbers compared to white working classes, given the fact that these two communities suffer from both racial and social barriers to progression into higher education. Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities are some of the most socially disenfranchised minority groups in the UK. In studying this phenomenon, Tariq Madood coined the term ethnic capital, which looks at how South Asian parents instill within their children a very positive perception of university education. This is then reinforced by other family members as well as the community at large. So most South Asian students, irrelevant of their class position, will be encouraged to enter HE and will have all the support structure to do so. In other words, students will be given advice on which courses to choose and on how to pass those courses. Shah briefly stated that ethnic capital amongst poorer South Asian students may be due to the impact of colonization and how the universities established in India during the British administration were held in great esteem. And if you're familiar with Bourdieu's theory, the positive perception of university is then part of the cultural trajectory for most South Asian students. A very recent discussion on this subject has been developed by some of my former tutors at the University of Huddersfield, who argue that ethnic minority students must enter higher education due to a lack of social capital which is needed to enter apprenticeships. They coined the term racial warehousing to describe how within the current economic context of late capitalism with higher levels of automation, there is a substantial amount of surplus labour, and as such the labour of ethnic minorities will be warehoused by way of continuing on to further and higher education, whereas white working class communities will be able to use their social capital in order to enter various forms of apprenticeships. Avis et al. Spoke about this from a theoretical lens. My research provided some empirical evidence. When I questioned my participants on why they decided to even go to universities, a common response was that they had no alternative. In my opinion, the students at the University of Bradford are archetypical of high ethnic capital and low social capital, which explains in many ways the higher number of local ethnic minority participation. Now, as a caveat, the very positive participation rates must be viewed with caution. Researchers have observed that ethnic minority students are generally concentrated in new or less prestigious HE institutes. Vicky Bolivar popularized the term ethnic penalty, which describes how ethnic minority students are less likely to be accepted to Russell Group universities, and those that are accepted experience more stringent entry procedures than their white counterparts. So what about ethnic attainment? Well, it's safe to say that there is an ethnic attainment disparity. That is to say, your ethnic background will give you an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to attainment. But that's not a complete picture. There is also the gender and class dynamic. So the highest achieving student cohort in the whole sector are white middle class females. The lowest performing are black working class males. When it comes to Asian students, Chinese and Indian students perform on par with white students. Pakistani and Bangladeshi students generally have low attainment. With Pakistani males, the data shows that their underattainment has increased over the years. Muslim females are performing better than males. Some interesting work by Khattab and Madood discuss how Muslim females are relying a lot more on their Islamic values to break some of the cultural barriers that may impede South Asian Muslim females from higher attainment. Now, one of the interesting aspects of studying the literature on ethnic attainment is that you realize certain categories and ways of framing the challenges we face are not representative of that challenge. Data shows that yes, your ethnicity will impact educational outcome, but it does not have to be framed in the BAME versus white category. The dichotomous view does not highlight the complexity of the issue. Various factors impact attainment, not only race but gender and class. So what are some of the reasons why there is an ethnic attainment disparity? There are generally two lines of argument, one popular and the other not so popular. The least popular is the deficit model argument, which goes something like this. Ethnic minority students enter universities with low tariff BTEC courses, and BTEC courses are not optimal for success in higher education. Ethnic minority students also choose courses that are on average have low attainment, and they have high concentration in those courses, which means more students are likely to have low attainment. In other words, it's not some racial agenda to disenfranchise, it's the students' decisions that impact attainment. It's another way of saying it's their fault that they are failing. You can understand why this is not a popular position. The other side of the argument, and also the most common and generally the more accepted, is the institutional racism argument, which states that after accounting for prior qualifications, there is still an ethnic attainment disparity. That is to say that if a group of students with the same entry qualifications enter HE, they are more likely to have higher attainment if they are white than if they are an ethnic minority. The primary reason for this is the lack of support. Ethnic minority students need extra guidance and help because they are made to engage in learning spaces that possess a white middle class cultural hegemony. There is also the argument of staff complacency with regards to inclusivity, which brings to question the liberal ethos of universities and how liberalism assumes that social spaces are colorblind when in fact they are not. These two factors maintain forms of racial othering which disengages ethnic minority students. So the best way to see these two arguments is that the deficit model argues that student ability and choices leads to underattainment. The other groups say no, it's structural, and that underattainment can be attributed to university practices, namely the liberal ethos and staff complacency in dealing with EDI. So what was my take on the literature? Well, firstly, the deficit model is statistically driven, which means that we have no real understanding of student experience. Purely quantitative studies can only give you a correlation, which in this case is entry tariff scores and the class of degree achieved by ethnic minority students. That being said, with institutional racism, prior qualifications are inadvertently ignored, and that causes a number of problems because primary qualifications as a factor to low attainment creeps up over and over again. T.E. Richardson, who has been working for many years on the subject, attempting to identify issues of race within institutions, argued that prior qualifications as a variable explains 50% of the attainment disparity. And then you have to deal with gender, religion, class and race. So as a single variable, prior qualification is a very powerful indicator of attainment. Another issue with purely qualitative research aiming to identify institutional racism is that there is no indication of direct or overt racism in the data. There might well be cases, but it's very hard to prove due to what is known as an omitted data bias. In other words, no one will explicitly say that they are racist, especially to a researcher for a research project. Explicit racism is very hard to capture in a research project. Additionally, there is the issue of generalizability. Given the diversity of university contexts and the experiences of diverse students within them, in some studies there is a lot of racism, whilst in others there is a lot less. So there's nothing conclusive on overt or explicit forms of racism. So the only way you can actually explain the residual attainment disparity after the prior qualifications are accounted for is in the embedded forms of othering that may occur due to the teaching, learning and the assessment practices adopted by universities. So this is a key point. The only way you can say with some level of certainty that there is racial othering taking place in universities is by examining the teaching, learning and assessment practices. You also have the issue of contextualization. Ethnic minority students tend to, in substantial numbers, participate in professional or vocational degree programs. But that context, that space and its dynamics have not been fully explored. So now the question is why? Firstly, why has the issue of ethnic attainment been framed as a BAME versus white challenge? Second, why are prior qualifications ignored as a factor to low attainment even though they are considered to have the strongest impact on student attainment? And why is the vocational context not considered when most of the ethnic minority students enter vocational or professional degree programs? The answer is simple: theory. The framework applied when interpreting the data. Now, there are many frameworks, some more dominant than others, but when it comes to analyzing the experiences of ethnic minority groups, one framework has gained political and academic clout is critical race theory, or CRT. So what is CRT? CRT begins by criticizing general liberal discourse for not taking into account unique experiences of diverse groups of people. For example, Marx's material class conflict does not recognize the experiences of minority groups. Bourdieu's cultural conflict is argued to value the white middle class culture because it defines white culture as the dominant culture. Same thing with feminism, it ignores the experiences of black females, and so on. A lot of liberal ideas are criticized in this way. The main argument of CRT is that the world is principally divided by race, and racism is endemic, which in European and American contexts is white people versus people of colour. Some go as far as to say that it's a global issue, analysing the impact of colonialism and the representation of white people through institutions such as Hollywood and general Western media. CRT borrows a lot from contemporary social theory, particularly Bourdieu. So the cultural conflict espoused by Bourdieu is defined by CRT scholars as dominance of white middle class culture, a form of Eurocentrism. And it's based on this principle that you hear notions like white supremacy and white privilege. Like structural class conflict discussed by Marxist scholars, CRT scholars view this as a form of structural racism. So you will hear things like microaggression, the subtle statements made by white people which leads to a form of racial othering. Interest convergence is another key idea, which basically means that when white people are trying to help minority groups, it's actually due to their own self-interest. So in America, for example, universities will accept African American males because of their athletic abilities, which will ensure that their college football team is more successful. Or in the UK, universities are accepting ethnic minority students because of student loans. And also the university is seen as being socially inclusive, which does wonders for marketing. White curriculum is another very popular notion that is advocated by CRT scholars, where the argument is that many university courses have a white bias in terms of representing and giving value to Western scholarship over others, thus maintaining a form of white privilege. Intersectionality is another concept that comes out of the CRT camp, and in my opinion this has become a theory on its own right. Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed CRT, went on to advocate intersectionality. Intersectionality is a very simple concept to understand. It argues that when individuals engage within a social space, multiple aspects of their identity will impact their experience. So race, gender, class, religion, and so on. CRT and intersectionality have gained significant political and academic clout, and there are various macro factors that have led to this. Some may argue that it functions as a counter-narrative to the rise of right-wing politics, but in my opinion, CRT and particularly intersectionality is a framework that fulfills the liberal goal of removing various forms of material and symbolic oppression in order for the individual to live as the authentic self, where no aspect of the individual's identity is discriminated. So how does this theoretical framework impact both research and practice? CRT is like any other conflict theory, like feminism and Marxism, which proposes that there is an inherent conflict between those who are dominant versus those who are subordinate. That inherent conflict does not allow for any political intervention. It creates no room conceptually where we can argue that the dominant group is actively seeking to better the life chances of subordinate groups. Within education, the lens of conflict causes many problems. Education as a process is challenging, i.e. the student must overcome a challenge in order to see a higher reality, whether that is to make sense of new learning material or acquire a new skill. Additionally, the learning process is generally an interaction between the more knowledgeable other, i.e. the teacher, and the student. That interaction inherently possesses power dynamics, while the teacher will nearly always hold positions of power. Now, given these two aspects of learning and education, when you apply conflict theories such as CRT, you may erroneously interpret the process of teaching and learning as a form of class or racial oppression. What may well be a situation where a student is in the process of overcoming a challenge may be interpreted as a form of exclusion, and what may well be a teacher sincerely attempting to teach and give value to a student from another ethnicity may be seen from the lens of conflict as a form of interest convergence, or to use Bourdieu's term, symbolic violence. Those are just some of the general issues you have when using conflict theory when analysing an educational setting. When it comes to making sense of some of the literature, other challenges arise. Firstly, the dichotomous view of BAME versus white is obvious here. CRT is principally dichotomous in the way it views the social world. Secondly, the issue of ignoring prior qualifications. CRT is very much about studying social spaces. In other words, to understand forms of white hegemony within the social setting. This means that there is an orientation in the research amongst institutional racism camp to not study transition. The research space is fixed, which in the case of HE is the university setting. Now, in terms of not studying vocational context, it appears to me at least that CRT as a framework has not been developed to analyse vocational curricula. CRT is very good at analysing academia, given the concept of white curriculum. So I can understand how academia can be racist if all we are teaching is Western philosophy. I can also understand how history can be racist if all we are teaching is the history of one particular racial group. But how does vocational education become racist? When in theory vocational education means that the teaching and the assessment is dedicated to the knowledge of best practice for a particular professional role. How does that teaching become racist? And remember, I cannot argue that a teaching process is racist simply by inferring that the teacher is white. We have limited evidence of overt racism. When I say how does vocational education become racist, I am referring to the teaching, learning and assessment practices. As stated before, it is only in the embedded nature of education that we can analyze forms of racial othering. Now, in order to analyze forms of racial othering in vocational courses, I looked at various other theories, and one theory that I was familiar with was academic drift, because it's somewhat popular within vocational education research. So, to be very brief, academic drift argues that when you have a hierarchically structured education system where traditional academia is considered prestigious, then the vocational systems, whether that's institutions, programs, teaching and learning practices, will adopt aspects of academic practice in order to achieve esteem. Academic drift from the perspective of vocational education is unwarranted development of vocational education. Academic drift theorists argue that vocational education is different from academia in many ways, such as vocational education is teaching intensive and requires greater teacher-student contact, whereas academia favors more independent learning, less teacher-student contact. Vocational education is focused on defined and, dare I say, narrow occupational protocols, whereas academia is broad. Vocational education is practical, whereas academia is focused on research and development of theory. So here are some ways in which vocational education adopts traditional academic practice from the perspective of academic drift theory. On the left column, you have a broad understanding of what a vocational course should look like. And on the right-hand column is what happens when the program drifts academically. By all means, pause here to see where your programs sit within this framework. So how does that help us understanding forms of othering within teaching and learning practices? John Pratt and Tyrell Burgess, who popularized the theory of academic drift, argued that academic bias within professional courses created the mismatch of expectations between students and staff. Within the context of English polytechnics, John Pratt argued that students who entered the polys sought vocational education. They wanted to develop skills and knowledge of practice, but because courses had drifted academically, the courses embodied forms of middle class, or in our case, white middle class identity, which led to tensions among students and staff. Students were required to write academically, carry out independent research, and study the history of the subject and so on. These practices were linguistically intensive, i.e. they required the students to know the rules of traditional academia, which was not part of their habitus. Academic drift theory argues that there is a vocational essence, an optimal way of teaching certain skills, which have evolved to embody academic practices that is inherently class and race-centric. The racial othering of students within professional courses is then a result of the unwarranted academic additions in professional courses that not only discriminate but take away the meaning of doing a professional course. So the reduced teaching hours and the implementation of a liberal ethos within professional programs continues to challenge non-traditional learners who must adapt to the academic rules of the game. This is further challenging for BAME learners who embody unique cultural assets and as such must negotiate socially oppressive and racially defined academic structures. Now, to provide some empirical backdrop, my research really brought this dynamic to life. So here's one example of a Pakistani male student engaging with assessment. As you can see in the first quote, there is a lot of tension, namely due to the linguistic challenge that academia poses. It is here that you can observe forms of othering in teaching and learning practices. Here is the same student doing a final year exam in taxation. Because the exam was focused on the protocols of calculating tax, there was greater engagement. The numerical and the set nature of the learning content meant better engagement and better outcome. The benefits of using academic drift is that you are able to overcome the problems that arise using the lens of conflict theory, which can create some general biases. We can consider the transition of students, we can accept that prior qualifications matter, and then we can evaluate our courses to identify the unwarranted academic teaching and learning assessment practices in order to ensure better engagement and hopefully better attainment from our students. If we were to analyze the two examples in the previous slide, from the lens of conflict, we will not be able to make sense why ethnic minority students are performing better in one form of assessment and not the other. With academic drift, we can then understand why and how that is the case. Now, before I conclude, as a footnote, I want to speak about an issue that was raised regarding academic drift as a framework, which is how does academic drift stop vocational courses from being instrumental? I think firstly the word instrumental must be deconstructed. I feel that often the word instrumental can misrepresent the ethos of vocational education. If we mean instrumental in its literal sense, the act of working towards a particular outcome, then even academia falls into that category. Academic work follows set patterns, embodies genre conventions, and has a set purpose, namely the pursuit for truth of a given phenomenon. Moreover, a recognized criterion for good academic work is brevity, or to rephrase, how instrumental the academic work is in serving the aim of uncovering the truth of a particular subject. The reason academic work values brevity is because it shows that the academic or the student is very focused in their thinking and that they are able to fully explore the subject at hand. Well, the same can be said about vocational education. It is common knowledge that by focusing on a set of skills or one particular occupation, the individual is able to acquire very high levels of specialization or mastery. Now, if we mean instrumental as in serving the needs of the market, then yes, a very strong argument can be made that this can lead to negative outcomes. We do not want students to leave the university and simply be cogs in the corporate machine. It is also general knowledge that higher levels of specialization also helps overcome this issue. When individuals are specialized, they have a stronger labor market position. Students can feel empowered when entering the labor market and not be disposable, which is the case when individuals are within low-skilled occupations or are themselves low-skilled. Another issue, I suppose, when we contemplate on education being instrumental is the notion of student autonomy. That if we become too prescriptive in our teaching and assessment, are we not then taking away the students' right to think for themselves and to make their own decisions? Now, this is a very dense subject, and in many ways this is one of those perennial discussions within vocational education research, and has led to a healthy body of literature on the subject, which will be beyond the scope of this presentation. I hope to deliver another separate lecture on this subject. Now, what I will say is that all those terms, i.e. liberal education, vocational education, student autonomy, these terms need unpicking because I find that they are loaded terms and embody cultural biases that need to be brought to the fore in order to acquire a clear picture of the subject. So, to conclude, we have discussed ethnic participation and attainment, highlighting some unique dynamics around Asian students and their higher participation, as well as the complexities surrounding attainment. We then unpicked critical race theory to highlight some of the key biases in the way ethnic attainment is studied. And finally, academic drift as a framework was discussed as a way of overcoming some of the limitations that may arise from using critical frameworks in order to understand student experiences. I hope you all benefited from this, and thank you very much for joining me.